The millionaire knelt beside the homeless woman and handed her an unlimited credit card. When she used it to buy a simple meal, she didn't expect the reaction the attendant would have. Marco moved quickly, his polished shoes clicking on the pavement as he crossed the bridge to his meeting. He had his agenda set for the day: meetings, negotiations, and calls. He had no time for delays. The city was as usual, noisy and full of people who, like him, seemed to be in a rush to get somewhere. But today, something interrupted his steady pace. On the side of the bridge, he noticed a figure, a woman, wearing clothes that were barely holding together. She sat with her back against the cold concrete, holding a sign that simply read, "Help." Marco's eyes met hers for a split second. Her gaze was empty, tired. She wasn't just hungry, she was worn down, her spirit drained. Something in that brief moment got to Marco. It wasn't pity, it was discomfort. It was a feeling he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. He shook it off and kept walking. But after a few more steps, he paused. He looked down at his watch, the shiny piece that symbolized his success, and then back at the woman. His shoulders stiffened, and he drew a deep breath. He knew he should keep going. He had somewhere to be, people to impress, but he also knew he couldn't ignore that look. He turned back. "Hey," Marco said, approaching her slowly, as if she were a wild animal that might bolt if startled. The woman looked up at him, wary. She didn't say anything. Marco kneeled down next to her, ignoring the curious glances of people passing by. He reached into his pocket, hesitated for a moment, then pulled out his wallet. He took out a credit card, one without a limit. "Take this," he said, his voice a bit shaky. The woman blinked at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't reach for the card. "Why?" she finally asked. Her voice was rough, barely a whisper. Marco shrugged, not really having a clear answer. "Just get yourself something to eat, something you need." "Whatever." He paused, then added, "It's real, not a joke." The woman looked at the card, then back at Marco, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. She reached out slowly, her fingers dirty and trembling slightly. She took the card, but her gaze remained locked on Marco, waiting for him to laugh, to say it was a trick, but he didn't. He just stood up, gave her a short nod, and walked away. As Marco continued towards his meeting, he found himself feeling uneasy. He couldn't focus on the noise of the traffic or the distant chatter of the people around him. He kept thinking about the look in her eyes. He didn't even know her name. He pushed those thoughts away, entered the building, and forced himself back into his routine. But something inside him had shifted, and he couldn't ignore it. Elena, still holding the card, watched him leave. She glanced down at the card in her hand, flipping it over and inspecting it. It had his name on it, embossed in shiny letters. She didn't know if it was real. She didn't know if she could trust this stranger in a suit. Maybe it was a setup. Maybe he was just another person playing a twisted game with her because she was vulnerable. She stood up, shaky on her feet, and started walking. She needed to decide whether to take a chance or throw it away. It wasn't just about money. It was about trusting, even if just a little. And that, after everything she had been through, was the hardest part. The rest of the day, Marco went through the motions. He spoke to clients, made promises, negotiated deals. But the face of that woman stayed with him. He thought about her sitting there, in the cold. He thought about her hesitation. He knew it was strange. Why should he care? He had done his part. But that hollow feeling in his chest didn't leave, and he couldn't help but wonder if she had used the card or thrown it away. Elena walked with her head down, her hand gripping the credit card like it was a fragile lifeline. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. She saw a small restaurant across the street, a place that looked just normal enough to not throw her out based on her appearance. Her feet moved her towards it before her mind could catch up, each step feeling heavier with doubt. She pushed open the door, and a little bell above her head rang. The restaurant wasn't crowded, just a few people here and there, sitting at tables, eating alone or chatting quietly. The waitress behind the counter gave her a look, one that Elena had seen too many times before: suspicion, judgment, disdain. Elena avoided her gaze and went to the counter. Can I have something to eat?" she asked, her voice almost drowned out by the noise of plates and cutlery clinking. The waitress looked her up and down, lips tightening. "Do you have money?" the waitress asked, raising an eyebrow. Elena swallowed, her throat dry. She nodded and took the credit card out of her pocket. The waitress's eyes narrowed. She took the card, turning it over in her hand, examining it like it was counterfeit. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice louder, attracting the attention of a few customers nearby. Elena shifted uncomfortably, her shoulders tensing. She hated this, being put on the spot, being looked at like she was doing something wrong. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The pressure was too much. She felt her heart thudding in her chest, her palms sweaty. She began, but she didn't know what to say. She didn't know if the card was real, didn't know if it would even work. The waitress sighed, rolling her eyes, and looked over her shoulder. "Hey, Frank," she called, waving at a man in the back. The manager. Elena's chest tightened even more. A heavy-set man in his 50s approached, wiping his hands on a towel. He looked from the waitress to Elena, then at the card. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. The waitress handed him the card, her mouth a thin line. "She says she wants to buy something, but look at her," the waitress said, her voice dripping with disbelief. "And she's got this card." Frank took the card and looked at it for a moment. He glanced at Elena, taking in her worn-out clothes, her tired eyes. There was a moment of silence. Elena could feel everyone watching, judging. It was like a spotlight was on her, and she wanted to disappear. Frank finally handed the card back to her, his expression softening just a bit. "All right," he said. "What do you want to eat?" Elena blinked, surprised. Just something small. Soup, or a sandwich," she said, her voice shaky. Frank nodded and gave a look to the waitress, who still seemed unconvinced. "Get her a sandwich," he said, his voice carrying a finality that made the waitress turn and head towards the kitchen, grumbling under her breath. Elena felt her knees go weak, and she sat down at the counter. She couldn't believe it. She actually managed to get food. It was real. A few minutes later, a plate with a simple sandwich was placed in front of her. She picked it up, her hands still trembling, and took a bite. It wasn't much, a simple ham and cheese, but to Elena, it tasted like hope. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, trying to remember the last time she had real food. People in the restaurant went back to minding their own business, but Elena still felt the lingering stares. She tried to ignore them. As she chewed, she looked at the credit card on the counter next to her. She couldn't shake the feeling that any moment someone would come and take it away. She glanced towards the door, half expecting Marco to show up and tell her it was all a joke, but no one came. Meanwhile, Marco sat in a meeting, his phone buzzing with notifications. He tried to pay attention to the presentation, but his thoughts kept drifting. He wondered if she had used the card. He wondered if she had thrown it away, decided not to trust him. He shook his head, trying to clear his mind, but it didn't work. The feeling from earlier hadn't left him. He pulled out his phone and discreetly opened the banking app, just to check. Nothing had been charged. Maybe it was for the best, he thought. Maybe she didn't trust him, and that was okay. It wasn't his job to fix anything. He put his phone away, nodding to something one of his colleagues was saying, but the emptiness in his chest didn't go away. Back in the restaurant, Elena finished her meal. She felt full for the first time in days. She stood up, took the card, and headed to the counter again. The waitress glared at her but said nothing as Elena handed over the card to pay. The machine beeped, and the transaction went through. Elena let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She left the restaurant, the bell above the door ringing again as she stepped out into the street. She felt the eyes of the people in the restaurant on her back until the door closed. She walked down the street, unsure of where to go next, but she had the card, and for now, that meant she had something. As she walked, she found herself glancing at shop windows, things she hadn't allowed herself to do in years. A display of clothes, a shelf of fresh bread, a little shop with soaps and shampoos. She looked at her reflection in the glass. Her hair was matted, her face was dirty. She looked tired, older than her years, but the card in her pocket felt like a key. Maybe she could get some soap. Maybe she could clean up. She wasn't sure yet if she trusted Marco, or even if she trusted herself. But she had the card, and that meant options, and that was more than she'd had in a long time. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling just a little less. For the first time in forever, she felt like there was a possibility. A small one, but it was there. She just needed to decide if she could take that chance. Marco sat at his kitchen table, staring at his laptop screen. The fattura of the credit card had arrived in his inbox. He knew he shouldn't be so curious about it, but he clicked on it without hesitation. The page loaded slowly, and when it did, Marco found himself squinting at the list of items. Food, bread, soap, a few simple clothes. He scrolled down and saw only basic things, things someone needed to survive. There were no luxury items, no misuse, just pure necessity. Marco swallowed. He felt a strange pang in his chest, something between sadness and shame. He had all the resources he could ever need, but Elena was using this open credit to buy things like soap. It felt like he was being forced to see the reality of her life, a reality far removed from his. He pushed his laptop away and rubbed his temple. He had to see her again. He had to know what was happening. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. Either way, it didn't matter. He grabbed his coat and walked out of his apartment, taking the elevator down to the street. He made his way to the bridge where he had first seen her. It was the middle of the afternoon, and the street was busy, crowded with people rushing to and from work. Marco looked around, searching for any sign of Elena. The spot where she had been sitting was empty. He frowned, taking a few steps closer, his eyes scanning the area. "Hey, you looking for someone?" A voice called from behind. Marco turned to see a man, scruffy-looking, standing by the side of the bridge. His clothes were worn, and his face was covered in grime. He had a suspicious glint in his eyes. "There was a woman here. She was sitting right there," Marco said, pointing to the empty spot. "Do you know where she went?" The man looked at Marco, then smirked. "Oh, you mean the lady with the credit card?" he said. "Yeah, we heard about her. She's been around, but she ain't here now. Folks are talking about her, though. Got herself some stuff. Guess she's lucky." Marco felt a jolt of unease. He didn't like the way the man was talking, like Elena was some kind of spectacle. "Do you know where she is?" he asked, his voice tense. The man shrugged, then pointed down the street. "Maybe over that way, but if you ask me, she's got herself some attention she might not want," he said, his tone darkening. "People out here, they see someone getting help. They get jealous. They get desperate." Marco nodded, a knot tightening in his stomach. He turned and walked quickly in the direction the man had pointed. He passed rows of shops, his eyes scanning the alleyways and doorways. Finally, he spotted her. Elena was standing near the entrance of a small convenience store. She had a few bags in her hands, and around her were a group of people, 3 men, all scruffy, their eyes locked on her bags. One of them stepped closer, his voice low but menacing. "Hey, share some of that, huh? You got enough there. Come on, don't be greedy," the man said, his hand reaching towards one of the bags. Elena stepped back, her eyes wide. "I don't have anything for you," she said, her voice shaking. The man scowled, stepping closer. Marco didn't think. He acted. He rushed towards them, his heart pounding. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice sharp. The men turned to look at him, their eyes narrowing. "Leave her alone," Marco said, his tone firm. He stepped between Elena and the men, his body tense, ready for anything. The men eyed him, sizing him up. They looked at each other, then back at Marco. One of them scoffed. "Man, what's it to you? She's got more than she needs," the man said, but there was hesitation in his voice. Marco didn't move. "Back off," he said, his voice steady. The men exchanged glances. Then one of them muttered something under his breath. Slowly, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Marco let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Elena, who was staring at him, her eyes wide, her face pale. "Are you okay?" Marco asked, his voice softer now. Elena nodded, but she looked shaken. She clutched the bags to her chest, her hands trembling. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Marco hesitated, then shrugged. "I wanted to see if you were okay," he said simply. Elena's eyes narrowed, and she shook her head. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice filled with frustration. "Why are you doing this? Do you think giving me a card is going to fix anything? Do you think it's going to change my life?" Her voice was rising, her emotions spilling over. Marco stood there, silent. He didn't have an answer. Elena took a deep breath, her eyes glistening. "You don't understand. You think this is easy. Just because I have some money now doesn't mean everything's fine," she said, her voice breaking. Marco swallowed, the weight of her words hitting him hard. He looked down at the ground, his hands in his pockets. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it's not enough. But I just wanted to help." Elena shook her head, her expression softening just a bit. She looked away, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know if I can do this," she said, her voice barely audible. Marco took a step closer, his eyes on her face. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "I don't know what I'm doing, but I want to help, not just with money, however I can." Elena looked at him, her eyes searching his face. There was a long silence, and then she nodded, just slightly. She didn't say anything, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe trust, maybe hope. Marco didn't know, but he knew he wasn't going to walk away. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you somewhere safe." He reached out, gently taking one of the bags from her. She hesitated, then let him take it. They started walking, side by side, down the busy street. Marco didn't know what would happen next, but for now, they were moving forward, together. Elena lay on the thin mattress of the shelter, staring at the ceiling. It was late, but she couldn't sleep. Her mind kept running, replaying what had happened in the street. The men, Marco stepping in, his strange insistence on helping her. She didn't understand why he cared. People like him, rich, clean, comfortable, didn't usually bother with people like her. She sat up, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. The room was dark, the soft sounds of other people sleeping filling the space. She stood and quietly left the room, moving into the hallway and towards the small communal bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her face looked tired, her eyes dull. She had used some of the soap she bought, but it wasn't enough. The exhaustion of years on the street didn't wash away easily. She turned on the faucet, splashing her face with cold water. It woke her up a little, but the feeling of fear and uncertainty lingered. She dried her face with a scratchy towel and left the bathroom, making her way back to her bed. She wanted to sleep, but it felt impossible. Her mind wouldn't let her rest. The next day, Elena decided to use the card again. She needed some basic things: food, a new pair of shoes, anything to make her feel like she was more than just surviving. She kept her head down as she walked through the streets, feeling the weight of every step. She tried to avoid looking at anyone, especially those who might recognize her from before. She entered a small grocery store, picking up some bread, cheese, and a few apples. She moved quickly, trying to attract as little attention as possible. When she got to the counter, the cashier barely looked at her, scanning the items mechanically. She handed over the card, her heart pounding. But the transaction went through without issue. She let out a breath, feeling a small sense of relief. But as she stepped out of the store, she noticed a figure out of the corner of her eye. A man, standing across the street, watching her. He was the same one from the day before, the one who had tried to take her bags. He was following her. Elena's heart jumped, her breath catching in her throat. She turned away quickly, trying to blend into the crowd. She couldn't let him see where she was going. She walked faster, her eyes darting around, trying to lose him. She made her way down a side street, her heart pounding. She needed to get back to the shelter, somewhere safe, but she could hear footsteps behind her, steady and deliberate. She turned, and there he was, following her. He had a cold, determined look on his face. "Hey!" he called out, his voice low and threatening. "Where do you think you're going?" Elena felt a wave of panic. She couldn't outrun him, not with the bags in her hands. She turned another corner, hoping to find a busier street, somewhere she could disappear. But the man was gaining on her. She felt her throat tighten, her palms sweating as she gripped the bags tighter. Suddenly, she heard a voice, a familiar voice. "Elena!" It was Marco. He was standing at the end of the street, his eyes wide with concern. He started walking towards her, his eyes fixed on the man behind her. The man stopped, his face darkening. He looked from Elena to Marco, then back again. Marco reached Elena's side, putting himself between her and the man. "Leave her alone," Marco said, his voice firm. The man sneered, his eyes narrowing. "What? You her bodyguard now?" he asked, his tone mocking. "If that's what it takes," Marco said, his voice calm but unwavering. The man stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head, muttering something under his breath before turning and walking away, disappearing around the corner. Elena let out a shaky breath, her legs feeling weak. She looked up at Marco, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and anger. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marco looked at her, his expression serious. "I told you, I wanted to help. I couldn't just leave you alone out here," he said. Elena shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "You don't get it," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't understand what it's like. Every time I turn around, someone is there, trying to take whatever little I have. It's not just about money, it's about survival, and I'm tired. I'm so tired." Marco reached out, gently touching her arm. "I know I don't understand everything, but I want to try. I want to help you get somewhere safer, somewhere where you don't have to look over your shoulder all the time." Elena looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She wanted to believe him, but it was hard. She had been let down so many times before. She took a deep breath, wiping her eyes. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, but I don't need charity. I need a chance, a real one." Marco nodded. "I understand. Let's go back to the shelter for now. We'll figure something out." They walked together in silence, the tension between them slowly easing. Marco could feel how fragile this connection was, how easily it could break if he said the wrong thing. But he wasn't going to give up. He had seen something in Elena, something worth fighting for. He didn't know where this was going, but he knew he couldn't just walk away. They reached the shelter, and Elena led him inside. It was crowded, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and old blanket. Marco looked around, his expression unreadable. He followed Elena to her corner, where she set her bags down. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Marco nodded, sitting down on the floor next to her. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I just want to make sure you're okay." Elena looked at him, her eyes tired but grateful. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe she didn't have to face it alone. Marco leaned back against the wall, watching as the people in the shelter moved around them. He knew this wasn't the solution, not yet, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. Marco sat against the wall of the shelter, watching as people moved in and out of the room. The shelter was noisy, filled with conversations and the rustling of people shifting in their makeshift beds. The air was thick, but Marco didn't leave. He wanted to be there for Elena, even if it meant being uncomfortable. Elena moved slowly, unpacking the few items she had brought with her. She pulled out the bread and cheese and handed some to Marco. He shook his head. "I'm good. Really, you should keep it," he said, giving her a small smile. Elena hesitated, then took a piece of bread for herself. She chewed it slowly, her eyes distant, her thoughts clearly somewhere else. A woman approached them, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. Her name tag read, Maria. She knelt down next to Elena, giving her a warm smile. "Hello, dear. I saw you come in earlier. I'm Maria, one of the volunteers here. How are you holding up?" Elena looked at her, then shrugged. "I'm fine," she said, her voice flat. Maria didn't push, just nodded. "Well, if you need anything, we're here. We have a lot of people here with their own struggles, and sometimes it helps to know you're not alone," Maria said, her voice gentle. She placed a small pamphlet next to Elena, one with information about services the shelter offered. "Just think about it," Maria said, then stood up and walked away. Elena stared at the pamphlet, her jaw clenched. She didn't need a handout, she told herself. But something about Maria's kindness made her pause. She picked up the pamphlet and flipped through it, reading about support programs, counseling, and opportunities for work. It felt overwhelming, but it also felt like hope, something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. "Maybe it's not so bad here," Marco said, his eyes on Elena. She looked up at him, her eyebrows raising slightly. "You don't have to say that just to make me feel better," she said, her tone blunt. Marco shook his head. I mean it. It's not ideal, I know, but you're not alone here, and that's something," he said. Elena looked at him, her expression softening. She wanted to argue, but part of her knew he was right. For so long, she had felt like she was on her own, like no one cared if she lived or died. But here, even if it wasn't perfect, there were people who understood. She looked back at the pamphlet. One of the programs caught her eye. A support group for women who had been displaced. She wasn't sure she could handle it. The idea of talking about everything she had been through made her stomach twist. But Maria's words echoed in her head. "You're not alone." Elena took a deep breath. She turned to Marco, her eyes serious. "I think I want to try that," she said, pointing at the pamphlet. Marco looked down at it, then back at her. "Yeah, I think that's a good idea," he said, his voice soft. He could see how hard it was for her to admit that she needed help. He admired her strength, even in this small moment. "I'll be here, whatever you need." The next morning, Elena went to the support group meeting. It was held in a small room in the back of the shelter. There were a handful of women there, all sitting in a circle. Maria was there too, smiling warmly when Elena walked in. She gestured for Elena to take a seat, and Elena did, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Maria began the session, introducing herself and asking everyone to share a little about their story. One by one, the women spoke. their voices filled with pain, but also with resilience. Elena listened, her eyes down, her heart pounding. When it was her turn, she hesitated, her throat dry. "It's okay," Maria said gently. "You can say as much or as little as you want." Elena nodded, taking a deep breath. I've been on the streets for a while," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I lost my home, everything. It's been hard." She paused, her eyes welling up. "I'm just tired. I don't know how to start again." Maria nodded, her eyes kind. "That's okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You're here, and that's a start." Elena looked around the room, seeing the other women nodding in understanding. For the first time, she felt like maybe she wasn't alone. Maybe there was a way forward, even if she couldn't see it yet. After the meeting, Marco was waiting for her outside. He stood up when he saw her, his eyes searching her face. "How was it?" he asked. Elena shrugged, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "It was okay. Hard, but okay." Marco smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "That's good. I'm proud of you," he said. Elena looked at him, then looked away, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Don't get sappy on me," she said, but her voice was lighter, less guarded. Marco chuckled. "I'll try not to," he said. They walked out of the shelter, the sun shining down on them. For the first time in a long time, Elena felt like maybe she could do this. Maybe she could take the small steps she needed to get her life back. Marco walked beside her, keeping his distance just enough to let her know he was there, but not smothering her. It wasn't about charity anymore. It was about support, real support, the kind that didn't come with strings or expectation. "Let's get some fresh air," Marco said. "We could both use it." Elena nodded, and they walked down the street, side by side. It was a small step, but it felt like progress. And for now, that was enough. It was a quiet afternoon in the shelter. Elena was sitting in the common area, her eyes fixed on a book someone had left behind. She wasn't really reading it, just trying to keep her mind occupied. The days had been calmer since she had decided to join the support group. The shelter wasn't much, but it was stable, and that was something she hadn't had in years. Marco had been visiting almost daily, bringing small things, groceries, supplies for the shelter, or sometimes just himself. He would sit beside her, making quiet conversation or simply listening when she needed it. It was a strange kind of comfort, having him there. He wasn't trying to fix her life anymore. He was just being there, and that was enough. Elena was flipping through the book absent-mindedly when she heard someone call her name. She looked up and saw a man approaching her, a face she hadn't seen in years. Her stomach twisted. It was David, someone from her past, someone who knew her when her life was different. "Elena?" David said, his voice full of disbelief. He looked at her, his eyes wide. "Is it really you?" Elena's face went pale, her heart beginning to pound. She hadn't seen David since before she lost everything. He had been a friend, or so she had thought. But he had been part of the reason her life had gone downhill. He had convinced her to trust someone, to invest in something that turned out to be a scam. She had lost her home, her stability, everything. She stood up, her hands trembling. "David, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tense. She could feel the eyes of others in the shelter on her. She hated it. She didn't want anyone knowing her past, knowing her mistakes. David took a step closer, his face softening. "I didn't know you were here. I thought you moved away after everything happened," he said, his voice low. "I didn't know things had gotten so bad." Elena's eyes flashed with anger. "You didn't know. You were part of why it happened," she said, her voice rising. "You told me to trust him. You told me it was a good idea." David's face fell, and he looked down at the ground. "I know, and I'm so sorry, Elena. I didn't know what he was doing. I didn't know it was going to end like that," he said, his voice heavy with regret. Elena shook her head, her eyes stinging with tears. "Well, it did, and I've been paying for it ever since," she said. She turned away, her hands clenched at her sides. She didn't want to hear his apology. She didn't want to relive everything that had happened. David reached out, his hand almost touching her shoulder. "Elena, please, let me help you now. Let me try to make it up to you," he said. But Elena stepped away, shaking her head. "No, you've done enough," she said, her voice cold. She turned and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the stares of the people in the shelter, and she hated it. She didn't want to be seen like this, weak, vulnerable. She walked out of the common area and down the hallway, her eyes burning. She needed space, needed air. She pushed open the door and stepped outside, the cool air hitting her face. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. A few moments later, Marco appeared in the doorway. He had seen her leave and had followed, his expression filled with concern. "Elena," he said, his voice gentle. "What happened?" Elena looked at him, her eyes filled with tears she couldn't hold back. "It's my past, Marco. It's all my fault. Everything that happened to me. I made the wrong choices, trusted the wrong people," she said, her voice breaking. "And now I'm here, trying to pick up the pieces." Marco stepped closer, his eyes steady on hers. "Hey, listen to me," he said, his voice firm. "None of this is your fault. You trusted someone who betrayed you. That doesn't mean you deserved what happened. You did the best you could." Elena shook her head, her tears spilling over. "But look at me," she said, her voice cracking. "Look where I ended up. I can't even trust myself anymore." Marco reached out, gently placing a hand on her arm. "You don't have to do this alone, Elena. We all make mistakes, but you're here now, and you're fighting. That's what matters," he said. Elena looked at him, her eyes searching his face. He wasn't judging her. He wasn't looking at her like she was broken. He just saw her, saw the person she was, not the mistakes she had made. She took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing just a little. "Thank you," she whispered. Marco nodded, giving her a small smile. "You're stronger than you think, Elena, and you're not alone. Not anymore," he said. He stepped back, giving her space, but staying close enough to let her know he was there if she needed him. Elena wiped her eyes, looking out at the street. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she knew she couldn't keep running from her past. She had to face it, to accept it. Only then could she move forward. Marco stood beside her, silent, giving her time to process. He understood now that his role wasn't to fix things for her. It was to be there, to support her as she figured out her own path. He had learned that real help wasn't about grand gestures. It was about being present, truly present. Elena looked at him, a small, tentative smile on her lips. "I want to try again," she said, her voice quiet. "I want to start over. I don't know how yet, but I want to try." Marco nodded, his eyes warm. "Then let's figure it out, one step at a time," he said. They stood there together, the city bustling around them, the noise of the streets a constant hum. For the first time, Elena felt like maybe, just maybe, she could face whatever came next. She wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. Elena was beginning to find her place in the shelter. It wasn't perfect, but it was the closest she had felt to stability in a long time. The support group was helping her, even if it was hard to share her story. Each day was a step forward, even if they were small one. Marco kept coming by, and their conversations became a constant that Elena found herself relying on. He wasn't pushing her to move faster than she was ready, and he wasn't pretending to understand things he couldn't. He was just there, and that was enough. But there were still dangers. The streets didn't let you forget easily. One late afternoon, as Elena was leaving the shelter, she saw him again, the same man who had threatened her before. He was waiting in the alley beside the shelter, his face shadowed, his eyes locked on her as soon as she stepped outside. "Hey," he called out, stepping towards her. "You got something for me today?" His voice was sharp, his expression hard. Elena froze, her heart pounding. She felt the familiar cold rush of fear take over her body. She tried to step back inside, but he moved quickly, grabbing her arm. His grip was rough, and she felt panic rising in her chest. "Come on, you've been living large with that card, haven't you? You think you get to keep it all to yourself," he sneered, his eyes wild. Elena struggled against him, trying to pull her arm free. "Let go of me," she yelled, her voice strained. She twisted, trying to break free, but his grip was tight. She felt the sharp sting of his nails digging into her skin. Suddenly, she heard Marco's voice. "Hey, get your hands off her." Marco's voice was loud, commanding, as he rushed towards them. He reached them within seconds, his eyes blazing with anger. He grabbed the man's arm, pulling him away from Elena. The man turned, his eyes narrowing at Marco. "Who the hell are you? You think you can just step in?" he spat, shoving Marco back. Marco stumbled, but he didn't back down. He stepped forward again, putting himself between Elena and the man. "I'm not letting you hurt her," Marco said, his voice low but firm. There was a determination in his eyes that he had never felt before. He wasn't just some businessman anymore. He was someone willing to stand up for Elena, no matter the cost. The man laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "You think you're some kind of hero? You don't know what it's like out here. You don't belong here," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Marco clenched his jaw, his body tense. "I know enough, and I know you're not going to touch her again," he said, his voice steady. Elena stood behind Marco, her breath coming in short gasps. She felt the fear, but she also felt something else, anger. She was tired of being afraid, tired of being a victim. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on the man who had terrorized her. "Get out of here," she said, her voice loud, stronger than she had expected. "I'm not scared of you anymore, and you're not getting anything from me." The man looked at her, his face twisting in frustration. He glanced at Marco, then back at Elena. For a moment, it looked like he might try to fight, but then he let out a huff, his face turning into an ugly sneer. "Fine, keep your damn card, but don't think this is over," he said, pointing a finger at Elena. Then he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the alley. Elena let out a long breath, her body shaking from the adrenaline. Marco turned to her, his eyes softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Elena nodded, though tears were brimming in her eyes. "Yeah, I'm okay," she said, her voice shaky. She looked up at Marco, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here." Marco shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're safe," he said. He stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You were brave. I could see it. You stood up to him." Elena looked down, her tears spilling over. "I'm just so tired of being scared. I don't want to live like that anymore," she said, her voice breaking. Marco nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. "You don't have to. We'll find a way, Elena. We'll get you out of this," he said. She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen, but there was a spark there, something that hadn't been there before. "I don't want you to save me, Marco. I want to save myself, but I'm glad you're here." "I don't think I could do it without you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marco gave her a small smile, his eyes warm. "I'm not going anywhere. I promise," he said. They stood there in the alley, the sun beginning to set behind the buildings, casting long shadows. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else now, determination. Elena knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but she also knew she wasn't alone. She had Marco, and she had herself, and that was enough to keep going. "Come on," Marco said, his voice gentle. "Let's go back inside. We need to figure out what comes next." Elena nodded, taking a deep breath. She followed Marco back into the shelter, her steps more confident, her head held a little higher. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was fighting, and she was ready to keep fighting, no matter what came next. The day after the confrontation, Elena woke up feeling different. The fear that had haunted her seemed to have lost its grip, replaced by something else, a sense of purpose. She lay on her bed in the shelter, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts moving faster than they had in a long time. She thought about Marco, about what he'd done for her, about how he'd stood by her without asking for anything in return. And she thought about what she wanted for herself. She needed to do more than just survive. She needed to take control, to be the one making decisions for her own life. That morning, she walked to Maria's office at the shelter. Maria looked up as Elena entered, smiling warmly. "Elena, good to see you. Come in, have a seat," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Elena sat down, her hands resting on her knees. She looked at Maria, her expression serious. "I want to do something," she said. "I want to contribute. I don't want to just be here, taking. I want to help." Maria's smile widened, her eyes softening. "That's wonderful, Elena. We could use the help. Is there anything specific you have in mind?" she asked. Elena hesitated, then nodded. "I used to sew. I was a seamstress. I want to start doing that again. Even if it's just small things, repairs, adjustments. I want to do something useful," she said, her voice steady. Maria nodded, her eyes lighting up. "That's a great idea. We have some sewing supplies here. People are always needing repairs to their clothes. I think that could be really helpful. I can set you up with a space to work," she said. Elena felt a sense of relief wash over her, a weight lifting off her shoulders. She was doing something that felt like a step towards the person she used to be. the person she wanted to be again. "Thank you, Maria," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. Later that day, Marco arrived at the shelter carrying a box of supplies. He had made a habit of visiting regularly, bringing things that he thought might help. He saw Elena across the room, sitting at a table with a small sewing machine. She was focused, her hands moving deftly, a look of concentration on her face. He walked over, setting the box down beside her. "Hey," he said softly, not wanting to interrupt her work. Elena looked up, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Hey, what's all that?" she asked, glancing at the box. "Just some things the shelter needed. Soap, toothpaste, that kind of stuff," Marco said, shrugging. He looked at the fabric in her hands, his eyes widening slightly. "Are you sewing?" Elena nodded, her smile growing. "Yeah, I asked Maria if I could help out. It's been a long time, but it feels good, you know, to do something with my hands again," she said. Marco smiled, a warmth spreading through him. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "That's amazing, Elena. I'm really proud of you," he said. Elena looked down at her work, a hint of color rising in her cheeks. "Thanks. It's just a small thing, but it feels like a start," she said. She picked up the piece of fabric she was working on, a shirt with a tear in the seam. She sewed in silence for a few minutes, Marco watching her, admiring the focus in her eyes, the way her hands moved with confidence. "You know," Marco said after a while, "if you wanted, we could look into setting up something a bit bigger. Maybe sell some of the things you make. I mean, only if you want to. No pressure." Elena paused, her eyes lifting to meet his. She thought about it for a moment, her heart pounding with both fear and excitement. She had spent so long just trying to make it through each day, to survive. The idea of doing something more, of building something, was terrifying, but it was also possible, and that was something she hadn't let herself believe in a long time. "Maybe," she said, her voice tentative, "I mean, maybe that could work. I'd need to take it slow, but yeah, it might be worth a shot." Marco smiled, his eyes shining with encouragement. "Of course, one step at a time. You're doing great, Elena," he said. Elena nodded, her eyes dropping back down to her work. She wasn't used to hearing that, people telling her she was doing well, that they were proud of her. It was strange, but it also felt good. It made her want to keep trying, to keep moving forward. Over the next few days, Elena settled into a routine. She spent her mornings helping around the shelter, fixing clothes for people who needed it, and even teaching a few of the other women how to make small repairs. She found herself talking to people more, sharing her story with them, listening to theirs. She wasn't alone anymore, and she was learning to let people in, to let them see her not as someone broken, but as someone trying to rebuild. In the afternoons, Marco would visit. He would bring supplies, sometimes food, and sometimes just himself, ready to listen to Elena talk about her day or her plans for the future. One afternoon, he brought her a bundle of new fabric, bright colors that made her eyes widen in surprise. "I thought you might like these," Marco said, setting the fabric down on the table. "You can use them for whatever you want." Elena ran her fingers over the fabric, her eyes shining. "These are beautiful. Marco, thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Marco shrugged, smiling. "I just thought it might be nice for you to have something new to work with," he said. Elena looked at him, her eyes softening. "You're a good man, Marco. I know I don't say it enough, but I appreciate everything you've done for me. I really do," she said. Marco looked down, a small smile playing on his lips. "You don't have to thank me, Elena. I'm just glad I can help," he said. They sat together in comfortable silence, the noise of the shelter around them, the clatter of dishes, the low hum of conversation. Elena picked up the fabric, already imagining what she could make with it. She felt a warmth inside her that she hadn't felt in a long time. Something like hope, something like purpose. She looked over at Marco, who was watching her with quiet admiration. She knew that there was still a long way to go, that things wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she believed she could do it. She believed she could rebuild, not just survive. "Let's do it," she said suddenly, her voice steady. Marco looked at her, his eyebrows raising. "Do what?" he asked. "Let's try to sell the things I make. Let's make this something real," she said. There was a determination in her voice that hadn't been there before, a confidence that came from deep within. Marco's face broke into a wide smile. "Yeah, you mean it?" he asked. Elena nodded, her eyes shining. Yeah, I mean it. I want to do this. I want to take control of my life again, she said. Marco reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Then we'll do it, together, he said. And for the first time, Elena believed it. She believed she could take that chance, that she could make something of herself again. And she knew, no matter what happened, she wouldn't be alone. Elena had always imagined that big changes came in the form of dramatic events, huge moments where the whole world shifted in an instant. But the change in her life didn't happen like that. It happened slowly, with every small step she took, every tiny decision that moved her closer to the life she wanted. And now, as she looked around the bustling market, she felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. It was a clear, sunny day, and Elena was standing behind a small stall set up at the local market. The table in front of her was filled with her creations, colorful scarves, simple but neatly sewn shirts, and even a few bags she had made out of scraps. They weren't fancy, but they were hers, and people were stopping by to look, to talk, to buy. She could see curiosity in their eyes, and sometimes admiration. Marco stood beside her, not behind the table, but a few steps away, ready to help if needed, but letting Elena be in control. He smiled as he watched her interact with customers, her nervousness fading as she spoke about her work, her voice gaining confidence with each interaction. A young woman approached the stall, picking up a blue scarf and running her fingers over the fabric. Elena smiled at her, her eyes warm. "That one's made from a soft cotton blend," she said, her voice calm. "It's perfect for chilly evenings." The young woman smiled back. "It's beautiful," she said, holding the scarf up to her neck and looking in a nearby mirror. "I think I'll take it." Elena nodded, her heart swelling as she carefully folded the scarf and placed it in a small paper bag. She handed it to the woman, accepting the cash with a steady hand. "Thank you so much," she said, her smile reaching her eyes. The young woman walked away, and Elena took a deep breath, her hands resting on the edge of the table. She looked over at Marco, who gave her a thumbs up, his grin wide and genuine. "You're doing great," he said, stepping closer. Elena smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "It feels good," she said simply. "Better than I thought it would." Marco nodded, his eyes softening. "I knew you could do it. You just needed the chance," he said. They continued through the day, people coming and going, buying her creations or simply stopping to chat. Elena felt herself growing more comfortable, more confident. This wasn't just about making money, it was about being part of something again, about connecting with people. She was no longer invisible, no longer just another face on the street that people ignored. She was Elena, and she had something to offer. As the sun began to set, the crowd started to thin out. Elena looked around, feeling a mix of exhaustion and pride. She had sold more than she expected, enough to make a real difference in her life, enough to take another step forward. Marco helped her pack up the remaining items, his hands moving quickly as they worked side by side. He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I was thinking, maybe we could do this again next week, or even set up an online store. You know, something steady," he said, his voice tentative, as if he didn't want to push too much. Elena looked at him, her eyes widening slightly. An online store. It felt like a huge step, something that seemed almost out of reach. But then she thought about everything she had already done, every fear she had faced and overcome. She had stood up to her past, she had faced her fears head-on, and she had started rebuilding her life. Maybe it wasn't impossible. Maybe it was just another step, like all the others. "Maybe," she said slowly, her lips curling into a small smile. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. One step at a time. Remember?" Marco laughed, nodding. "Right, one step at a time," he agreed. They finished packing up, and Marco picked up the box of unsold items, carrying it easily. They started walking, the evening air cool against their skin. The market was closing down around them, the noise of vendors packing up and chatting filling the space. Elena looked over at Marco, her expression softening. "Thank you, Marco, for everything," she said, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. Marco looked at her, his eyes warm. "You don't have to thank me, Elena. You did this. I just walked with you," he said. Elena nodded, her heart swelling. He was right. She had done this. She had faced every fear, taken every step, and she knew she still had a long way to go. But she also knew that she could do it. She had Marco, She had the people in the shelter, and most importantly, she had herself. As they walked, they passed by the shelter. Elena looked up at the building, the place that had been her refuge when she had nowhere else to go. She felt a sense of gratitude, but also a sense of closure. She knew she wouldn't be here forever. She was moving forward, building something new for herself, something that wasn't defined by her past. They stopped at the entrance, and Marco set the box down, looking at her. "So, what's next?" he asked, his voice light. Elena looked at him, then looked out at the street, at the city that had once felt so cold and unforgiving. She took a deep breath, a smile spreading across her face. "Next, I keep going. I keep fighting, and I see where it takes me," she said. Marco nodded, his eyes filled with admiration. "I like that plan," he said. They stood there for a moment, the sun dipping below the horizon, the first stars beginning to appear in the sky. Elena looked at Marco, then reached out, taking his hand. She squeezed it gently, her smile soft. "Thank you for walking with me," she said. Marco smiled back, squeezing her hand in return. "Always," he said. And with that, they turned and walked into the shelter, side by side. It wasn't the end of the journey, not even close, but it was a new beginning. And for Elena, that was more than enough. She was ready for whatever came next, one step at a time.